The day my husband's will was scheduled to be read, I learned a truth that cut deeper than grief. A truth that didn't just break me, but erased me. I arrived in California carrying nothing but a paper bag of sun-warmed oranges, and the kind of hope only a mother can still carry after years of silence. My daughter had become a millionaire. A woman the world worshipped, the face of glossy magazines, talk shows, and healing seminars, where she spoke about rising from nothing. People called her a miracle. They didn't know that I was the one who picked up the pieces each time she fell. They didn't know the nights I worked hospital floors, the uniforms stained with bleach and tears. They didn't know I raised her alone, through hunger, rent notices, and the ache of being invisible. But that morning, I told myself a foolish thing. Maybe my daughter will remember me today. Her house looked like something stolen from heaven: white stone, glass walls, a driveway that belonged to billionaires. Not to the daughter I raised on food stamps. I walked up slowly, nervous that even the security camera might reject me. But the gate opened just this once. When she opened the main door, I froze. That wasn't my daughter. Not the girl with tangled hair and scraped knees. Not the girl who cried when I cut her sleeve for her cast. Not the girl who wrote poems calling me her mountain. The woman standing there looked like a portrait carved out of cold ambition. Her lips were painted a fierce red, her hair perfect, her expression sharp enough to cut. And the fear in her eyes, the fear of being seen with me, lasted just 1 second before it twisted into something darker. "Why are you here?" she hissed. No greeting. No hug. No moment of softened memory. Just a threat wrapped in panic. "You can't be here. Not today. Why didn't you call? Are you trying to ruin my career?" I opened my mouth, but she slashed my voice before it even formed. "The press is inside. Investors. People who believe I came from nothing. People who think my mother died when I was 6. Do you understand that? You aren't part of my story anymore. You're a liability." Her words didn't land like insults. They landed like funerals. A liability. Not mother. Not anything human. Just an obstacle. I held the oranges tighter, willing my hands not to shake. I didn't expect what came next. She shoved me. Hard. So hard I stumbled back down the steps, falling onto the stone edge. The paper bag ripped. Oranges spilled everywhere, rolling down the smooth walkway like tiny suns escaping gravity. Some cracked open. Their juice bled across the concrete. She didn't help me. She didn't even breathe in my direction. She only glanced back at her glamorous crowd, terrified someone had seen her shove a ghost she had claimed was dead. Then she laughed. A small, practiced laugh, and slammed the door. Behind it, her voice turned honey-sweet as she greeted the press. Cameras clicked. Champagne glasses clinked. And somewhere behind those walls she introduced her mother, the woman she had hired to replace me. Outside, an old neighbor peeked from behind her blinds, unsure if I was a stranger or a memory she once knew. I stood up slowly. My hip throbbed. My palms burned. But the real pain was something different. A hollowing that happens only when your child becomes a stranger. I left the oranges where they fell. Let them rot. Let her look at them and wonder if they smelled of what she buried. I didn't knock again. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. But I walked away knowing one thing. The woman behind that door was not my daughter, not anymore. I walked away from that mansion with a hollow heaviness in my chest. The kind that doesn't hurt like a wound but empties you like a slow leak. Each step felt like I was dragging years of sacrifice behind me. Every night shift I worked, every meal I skipped so she could eat, every lie I told myself that she would one day understand. The California sun was warm, but I felt cold, as if her rejection had peeled away the last layer of warmth I had kept alive for her. Cars passed by, people walked with purpose, and life moved around me as if I were invisible, and maybe I was. Maybe I had been invisible long before today. Long before she built a kingdom where her story had no room for the woman who carried her through poverty, heartbreak, sickness, and storms. My hands trembled when I reached the end of the street. I looked down at my palms, scraped, red, stinging from the fall, and realized they looked exactly like they did when I used to scrub floors in hospitals for double shifts. The world had changed. She had changed. Only my hands remained the same. I found a bus stop nearby and sat down slowly, pretending the metal bench wasn't burning from the afternoon heat. I placed my small purse beside me and tried to steady my breathing, but memory after memory kept crashing inside my mind like a tide that refused to recede. Her first day of school. Her first heartbreak. The night she swore she would never abandon me. All those moments pressed against my heart until it hurt to even blink. Yet beneath all that sorrow, something else started to form. A quiet, steady anger. Not the loud kind, not the violent kind, but the kind that rises only after a mother realizes she has been erased from her own story. I looked up, watching the mansion from a distance. Its walls glittered with wealth, but I knew those walls had been built on my exhaustion, my sweat, my silence. And the woman living inside it, my daughter, had buried me long before she declared me dead in her biography. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I could not sit there forever. So I stood, my knees trembling slightly, and walked toward the next bus arriving. I didn't choose a destination. I simply chose movement. Movement felt like survival. As the bus arrived and the doors opened with a soft hiss, I stepped inside without looking back. If I did, I feared I would see the version of myself I needed to let go of. A mother still waiting for a daughter who no longer remembered her blood. And so I kept my eyes forward, clutching the metal pole, letting the cold air wash over me as the bus pulled away from the house where I had died long before this day. The bus carried me through the city like a ghost drifting between lives, passing palm trees, cafes, neon signs flickering awake for the evening crowds, and families laughing in cars I would never sit in again. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, watching my reflection blur against the passing world. A reflection of a woman who looked older than she felt, worn from years of carrying stories no one cared to hear. I wasn't crying, not because I was strong, but because I was numb, as if my daughter's rejection had frozen something deep inside me. When the bus stopped near an old marketplace, I stepped off without thinking, swallowed by voices bargaining over fruits, the smell of fried food, and street musicians playing melodies far warmer than my morning had been. Yet even here among crowds and colors I felt painfully alone, like a person drifting through a world that no longer had a place for me. I walked slowly, my hands brushing against the edges of stalls as if grounding myself through touch. My heart kept replaying the same moment, her eyes when she opened the door. Eyes that didn't see a mother or a history or sacrifice. Just a threat. Just an inconvenience. I reached into my purse and touched the small envelope I had brought for her. The one containing the letter her father wrote before he died, believing, hoping, that she would one day soften enough to read it. I sat on a low stone bench near a fruit stall and took the envelope out, running my fingers across her father's handwriting. Tears finally burned behind my eyes, but I blinked them back. I wasn't ready to let the world see me break. Not here. Not yet. A young vendor approached me gently, asking if I needed help, but I forced a small smile and said no, because what help could anyone offer a mother whose child had killed her without touching her? I tucked the envelope back into my purse and stood, deciding this marketplace wasn't where I wanted my pain to live. So I walked again, letting my feet choose the direction, letting the evening breeze cool the heat building in my chest. I passed a small bookstore with lights just turning on, and something about its quiet warmth pulled me in. Inside, the smell of old paper wrapped around me like a blanket, reminding me of nights I used to read to my daughter when she was little, her head resting on my lap, her tiny fingers tracing pictures as if the world belonged to her. How strange that the same child years later could pretend I never existed. I ran my hand across the spines of books, feeling the texture of new beginnings, and for the first time since the morning, I felt a small flicker of grounding, as if the universe was whispering that not all things were lost, only the ones that were never meant to stay. But even that comfort was temporary. The truth remained. I had nowhere to return to. No home. No daughter. And the world outside this bookstore felt too large for a woman carrying nothing but memories. Still, I took a breath, straightened my purse, and stepped outside again, letting the first stars of the evening watch over me like distant, indifferent guardians. The night was beginning, and so was a journey I had never planned to take. Night had fully settled by the time I reached the quieter edge of the city, where streetlights flickered like tired sentinels and the hum of traffic faded into a distant murmur. I kept walking until my legs trembled under me, the weight of the day pressing into my bones as if grief itself had hands wrapped around my ankles. My purse felt heavier with every step, not because of what it carried, but because of what it represented. A life lived in service of someone who no longer remembered the shape of my love. When I finally spotted a small public park, dim and nearly empty, I sat down on a cold bench beneath a rusted lamp. The metal chilled my skin through my clothes, but I didn't move. I let the sky stretch above me, a deep velvet broken only by a sliver of the moon, and for the first time since morning, silence wrapped its arms around me, not the kind that suffocates, but the kind that forces you to face the truth without distraction. I thought about my husband then, about the nights we held each other through storms both literal and emotional, about the dreams we whispered in small apartments where hope was sometimes the only furniture we owned. He had believed our daughter would grow into kindness. He had believed she would honor the love that raised her. And yet here I was, a mother reduced to a stranger, exiled from her own blood. I pulled out the envelope again, the one with his final letter to her, and wondered if she would ever see the words he wrote with trembling hands. Would she understand his regret? His guilt? His plea for forgiveness she never even asked for? A soft breeze rustled the trees, and for a moment I imagined it was him. His presence brushing against me, reminding me that I wasn't as alone as the world made me feel. Still, the loneliness settled heavy. I watched shadows move across the grass as stray cats wandered between bushes, creatures surviving the night in silence, much like me. My stomach growled softly, reminding me I hadn't eaten since dawn. But hunger felt distant, irrelevant compared to the ache consuming my chest. I looked around, searching for some sign of direction, some hint of where a woman like me was supposed to go when her home no longer welcomed her. The city felt endless, unfamiliar, and indifferent. I considered checking into a motel, but the thought of sitting alone in a foreign room with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights made me nauseous. So I remained on the bench, letting the night air settle into my lungs. A group of teenagers passed by on bicycles, their laughter echoing through the park, their joy so effortless it stung. I watched them disappear down the path, swallowed by darkness, and wondered when life had stopped being that simple for me. When had survival replaced joy? When had motherhood become a debt no one intended to repay? My eyes grew heavy, my body weary, and I leaned back against the bench, closing my eyes for just a moment. But even in darkness, my mind wouldn't rest. It kept replaying the sound of the door slamming, the oranges rolling across the stones, the look in her eyes when she realized I wasn't part of her carefully constructed lie. A pain so deep pulsed inside me that breathing felt like swallowing broken glass. Yet somewhere beneath all that hurt, a small whisper echoed, one that said I had survived worse, that I was still standing, still breathing, still here. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something. I don't know how long I sat on that bench, maybe an hour, maybe the whole lifetime I had been carrying inside me. But eventually the night grew colder, and my body forced me to move. I stood slowly, my joints stiff, and walked toward the street where a row of old shops glowed faintly under tired neon signs. I found a small diner still open, the kind that smelled like burnt coffee and reheated memories, and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed weakly, as if even it was too exhausted to greet another soul. A waitress with kind but sleepy eyes glanced at me, gave a small nod, and pointed toward an empty booth. I slid into the cracked red leather seat, my fingers tracing the torn edges, grounding myself in the texture of a place that didn't ask who I was or who had abandoned me. When the waitress placed a cup of coffee in front of me without asking, I managed a soft smile, grateful for a kindness so small and yet so desperately needed. The steam rising from the cup warmed my face, and I wrapped my hands around it, letting the heat seep into my cold fingers like a reminder that I was still alive despite everything. As I sat there, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of a late-night radio host, my mind drifted once again to the years I spent raising a girl who now wished I were dead. I remembered her laughter, her tantrums, the scraped knees I kissed better, and the nights I stayed awake through fevers that terrified me more than hunger ever had. But I also remembered the day she changed, when she discovered a world where appearances mattered more than truth, where wealth was a ticket to acceptance, and where I, her mother with calloused hands and old clothes, had no place. She shed me the way people shed the parts of their past they're ashamed of. The coffee cooled as I lost myself in these thoughts, and a heaviness settled in my chest, a mix of sorrow and something darker, something like betrayal curdling into resolve. When the waitress refilled my cup, she asked gently if I was okay, and though her voice held genuine concern, I could only nod. How could I explain a wound created not by strangers but by the very love I had built my life around? When I finally stepped out of the diner, the air smelled of night-blooming jasmine, sweet and sharp at the same time. I pulled my shawl closer around me as I walked toward the bus stop again, now not out of fear but out of necessity. I needed to find a place to sleep. As I waited, a bus pulled up with only 2 passengers inside, and I boarded, choosing a seat near the back where shadows softened the edges of my pain. Months ago this would have terrified me, being alone, vulnerable, without a plan, but tonight I felt strangely steady. Something in me had cracked open, not in weakness but in awakening. I realized then that losing her, as cruel as it had been, might free me from years of walking on broken glass, from swallowing hurt to protect an illusion of family that she never valued. As the bus rolled through the sleeping city, lights streaking across the windows, I leaned my head against the glass and closed my eyes. The hum of the engine lulled me into a strange calm, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine a life not defined by her approval. A life where I lived for myself, not as a mother discarded, but as a woman rediscovered. And as the bus carried me into the unknown, I felt it, a tiny fragile spark inside me. Hope. The bus eventually reached the outskirts of the city, where buildings thinned out and the night felt heavier, almost expectant. I stepped off at the final stop, the cool air brushing against my face like a reminder that I had crossed into a place where no past version of me existed. Streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across cracked pavement, as if the world here was stitched together by forgotten stories. I walked slowly along the quiet road until I found a small cheap motel glowing beneath a buzzing neon sign. The front office smelled like old paper and disinfectant, and the tired man behind the counter barely lifted his eyes as I paid for a single night. He handed me a key with a faded plastic tag, and I climbed the creaking stairs to a room that felt suspended between decay and survival. Inside, the wallpaper peeled at the corners, the bed sagged at the center, and the dim yellow bulb overhead flickered as if unsure it wanted to stay alive. I stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the muffled laughter from some far-off life that wasn't mine. My purse slipped from my hand onto the bed, and I finally allowed the exhaustion of the day to crash into me like a wave breaking against a long-neglected shore. I sat down, ran my hands over my face, and felt the warmth of tears I hadn't realized were falling. It wasn't just sadness. It was grief for a life I had poured into someone who erased me, for a home I no longer had, for years spent believing that love guaranteed loyalty. I looked around the room and felt the strange pull of both emptiness and possibility. This place wasn't safe, wasn't comfortable, wasn't mine. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel trapped by expectations or roles. I was simply a woman alone in a room, breathing, hurting, surviving. I walked to the small bathroom and splashed water on my face, watching my reflection blur and regain focus under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The woman staring back at me looked fragile yet fierce, wounded but still standing. She wasn't the same woman who had knocked on her daughter's door that morning. She was someone new. Someone stripped of illusions, someone forced into rebirth. When I returned to the bed, I opened my purse and pulled out the envelope again. I held it gently, almost ritualistically, as if my husband's handwriting could anchor me. But instead of crying, I placed it carefully inside the nightstand drawer, as though symbolically letting go of everything tied to the pain of that house, that daughter, that past. Lying down on the stiff mattress, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner that sounded more like a tired sigh than a machine. Yet in that moment, despite the loneliness wrapping itself around me like a second skin, something shifted inside. A realization. A truth I had been too afraid to acknowledge. Losing her wasn't the end of my life, it was the end of a chapter that had long been bleeding me dry. And as the night deepened, as exhaustion finally pulled me toward sleep, I felt a strange but undeniable certainty that tomorrow, no matter how uncertain, belonged to me now. Not to her memory of me, not to the lie she told the world, not to the version of motherhood that demanded everything and returned nothing. For the first time in years, I whispered into the darkness, not as a plea but as a promise, to rebuild myself, even if it took the rest of my life. And as my eyes closed, I felt it again. That small spark of hope, glowing like a fragile ember in the ashes of everything I had lost. Morning sunlight seeped through the thin motel curtains like a hesitant visitor, painting the room in pale gold as if unsure whether it was welcome. I woke slowly, my body aching from the stiff mattress but my mind strangely clearer, as though the night had rinsed away the chaos that once drowned me. For a moment I didn't remember where I was. Then reality settled gently instead of violently, reminding me that I was far from the home I had built with love, but closer than ever to discovering who I was without it. I sat up, pressing my feet against the cold floor, grounding myself in the unfamiliar quiet. No one's demands echoed in my ears. No one needed saving. No one was waiting to take more of me. For the first time in years, the world felt still enough for me to hear my own breath. I opened the nightstand drawer and took out the envelope, the last remnant of a life that had fractured beyond repair. I held it with a calm hand, no longer trembling, and whispered a soft goodbye to the woman who had begged for a daughter's love. That woman wasn't here anymore. I placed the letter back inside the drawer and closed it gently, letting it stay in that room like a ghost I no longer had to carry. After freshening up, I stepped outside where the crisp morning air greeted me with the smell of asphalt slowly warming under the sun. Cars passed by, people hurried to work. The world moved as it always had, unaware that a woman stood in the parking lot relearning how to belong to herself. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and walked toward a small coffee shop near the motel. Inside, the chatter of strangers felt strangely comforting, a reminder that life existed beyond the wounds of family. I ordered a simple breakfast, something warm that touched my stomach like reassurance, and as I ate, I listened to conversations around me. Plans, dreams, arguments, laughter. It was the soundtrack of ordinary life, and it steadied me. I realized then that pain doesn't end in a single moment. It loosens little by little, with each breath taken in a new direction. When I finished my meal, I stepped back onto the sidewalk and looked at the road stretching ahead. I didn't know where I would go next or how I would rebuild from the broken pieces of yesterday, but the uncertainty no longer frightened me. Instead, it felt like an unopened chapter waiting for my hands. I took a deep breath and started walking, not toward anyone, not for anyone but for myself. With each step, my heartbeat felt stronger, more certain, more mine. I didn't have a home, but I had a future. I didn't have a daughter's love, but I had my own. And as the sun climbed higher, warming my face with a gentle, forgiving light, I understood something quietly powerful. Sometimes life doesn't end when people leave you. Sometimes it begins.